I am Jessica Lawrence, 32 years old, and I never thought my career in financial compliance would end with me sending 42 emails to federal investigators. But when your boss laughs in your face and says, "Your title was inflated anyway," after you warn him about serious violations, you learn to document everything. The look on his face when the auditors walked in asking specifically for me, priceless. Before I tell you how my boss's arrogance led to a federal investigation that cost him everything, drop a comment where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had your professional expertise dismissed. I spent 8 years building my career in financial compliance. After graduating with honors in finance from Cornell University, I earned my Certified Regulatory Compliance Professional designation and worked my way up through 2 prestigious firms before landing at Horizon Investment Partners. I had a reputation for thoroughness, integrity, and an uncanny ability to spot potential issues before they became problems. Horizon was a mid-sized investment firm, headquartered in a gleaming glass tower in downtown Chicago. We managed over $300 million in client investments, mostly for upper-middle-class professionals and small business owners who trusted us with their retirement dreams and college funds for their children. Not the biggest firm on the block, but respected in the industry for solid returns and ethical practices. When I joined Horizon 4 years ago, I immediately clicked with my colleagues. Melanie Parker, our operations manager, became my closest work friend. Tall with striking auburn hair, and a laugh you could hear across the office, Melanie had been with the company for over a decade and knew all its inner workings. "Jessica, you are exactly what this place needed," she told me during my first week as we grabbed coffee in the break room. "Someone who actually understands all those regulations the government keeps throwing at us." David Kim, our senior financial analyst, was another ally. Quiet and methodical, David had an incredible mind for numbers and a strong ethical compass. He often consulted me when he spotted unusual patterns in client accounts. "I would rather ask 1,000 questions than make one mistake with someone else's money," he once told me. I respected him immensely for that philosophy. The company culture, before new management arrived, was everything I had hoped for when I accepted the position. Client interests came first. Documentation was meticulous, and ethical considerations were woven into every decision. Our quarterly compliance trainings were taken seriously, not treated as checkbox exercises to satisfy regulators. My original boss, Thomas Reynolds, was a 30-year veteran of the financial industry who had seen every market crash and regulatory change since the 1980s. His silver hair and professor-like demeanor gave him an air of authority, but he was never condescending. Thomas recognized my expertise, and within 18 months promoted me to senior compliance analyst, giving me oversight of our regulatory documentation and risk assessment protocols. "Jessica, in this business our reputation is everything," Thomas told me when he offered the promotion. "Your attention to detail protects not just our clients but all of us. Never let anyone rush you or cut corners." I thrived under his leadership, implementing systems that streamlined our compliance processes while strengthening our regulatory standing. Our last 2 regulatory audits had gone smoothly under my watch, with auditors actually complimenting our documentation standards. Then came the announcement that changed everything. During a company-wide meeting last spring, Thomas revealed he had decided to retire early. "My wife has been patient for 30 years while I built this business," he told the gathered staff, his voice uncharacteristically emotional. "Now she wants to see the world, and I promised her we would do it while we still have our health." I was genuinely happy for Thomas, but selfishly concerned about who would replace him. The firm's partners conducted a search and eventually announced that Mark Wilson would be joining as our new Chief Compliance Officer, my direct supervisor. Mark came from a larger firm in New York, with impressive credentials on paper, 44 years old, with an MBA from Wharton, and a resume listing prestigious positions at top-tier financial institutions. The partners were clearly impressed by his pedigree, and confident he would help take Horizon to the next level. My initial hopes were high. I prepared a comprehensive overview of our compliance systems, complete with flowcharts and statistical evidence of their effectiveness. I spent an entire weekend putting together a beautiful presentation for his first day, eager to demonstrate our department's value. That enthusiasm lasted exactly 12 minutes into our first meeting. "This all seems unnecessarily complicated," Mark said, flipping through my carefully prepared materials with barely a glance. He was impeccably dressed in what I would learn was his uniform custom-tailored suits and Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. These are the systems that have successfully kept us in regulatory compliance for the past 3 years, I explained, trying to hide my surprise. They actually simplified our previous processes while increasing accuracy. Jessica, I appreciate your effort, but I have worked with the big players. Firms handling billions, not millions. His smile did not reach his eyes. I think we can streamline things further, make them more efficient. The way he said efficient sent a chill down my spine. In compliance, that word often translated to cutting corners. But I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. He was new after all, and perhaps had innovative approaches I hadn't considered. I am certainly open to improvements, I replied carefully, but these systems have been vetted through 2 regulatory audits with no findings against us. 2 audits at a small firm in Chicago, he said, with a dismissive wave. Trust me, I know what regulators are really looking for. The rest is just bureaucratic busywork. As he stood to end our meeting considerably earlier than scheduled, he added what I would soon recognize as his favorite phrase, "This is how things work in the real world." The implication was clear. My experience did not count as real world in his eyes, despite my proven track record. As I gathered my barely examined presentation materials, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. Something told me this was just the beginning of the problems Mark Wilson would bring to Horizon Investment Partners. Within weeks of Mark taking over, the careful compliance infrastructure I had built began to crumble. It started subtly with small changes that individually might seem insignificant but collectively undermined our regulatory safeguards. The first major change came when Mark decided to update our risk assessment parameters for new clients. Under our established protocol, potential clients with certain risk factors triggered enhanced due diligence, additional identity verification, deeper investigation into fund sources, and more extensive documentation requirements. These risk thresholds are too conservative, Mark announced during a department meeting 3 weeks after his arrival. We are turning away good business. I raised my hand. Those thresholds align with federal guidelines for detecting potential money laundering and fraud. Lowering them puts us at regulatory risk. Mark gave me what I would come to recognize as his patronizing smile. The guidelines give us flexibility for professional judgment. My professional judgment says we are being overly cautious. That afternoon, I sent my first documentation email. To Mark Wilson. Subject: Risk Assessment Parameter Changes. Date the 12th of April 2023. Dear Mark, as discussed in today's meeting, I want to formally document my concerns regarding the proposed changes to our client risk assessment parameters. Lowering the thresholds below current standards may put us out of compliance with FinCEN Advisory FIN 2020A001 and the BSA AML Examination Manual, Section 4.1. I have attached the relevant regulatory guidance for your reference. Respectfully, Jessica Lawrence, Senior Compliance Analyst. His response came back in minutes. Great concerns noted. Changes moving forward as discussed. MW. A week later, a potential client with multiple red flags came across my desk. Maxwell Holdings LLC was a recently formed company with complex ownership structure through 3 different countries, including one known for banking secrecy. They wanted to invest $2 million, which would make them one of our larger clients. Under our previous protocols, this would require at least 3 weeks of enhanced due diligence. Mark wanted it done in 3 days. These are sophisticated international investors, Jessica. If we make them jump through too many hoops, they will take their business elsewhere. Mark insisted when I raised concerns in his office. That is exactly the point of due diligence, I countered. If they are legitimate, they will understand the need for proper verification. If they are not willing to provide standard documentation, that is itself a red flag. Mark leaned back in his leather chair. You know what the partners care about: growth, new client acquisition, not bureaucratic paperwork that satisfies your need for dotting I's and crossing T's. It is not about my needs. It is about federal regulations that carry criminal penalties if violated, I said, struggling to keep my voice even. Your title was Senior Compliance Analyst, not Senior Partner last I checked, he replied with a smirk. The decision is made. Process the client. I noticed his use of past tense when referring to my title, but chose not to address it at that moment. Instead, I sent my second documentation email that evening, outlining the specific regulatory requirements we were skirting and the potential consequences. My seventh email came after discovering Mark had altered documentation after submission. I had prepared accurate disclosures for quarterly client statements, carefully detailing fee structures as required by SEC, Rule 2064-7. When the final versions went out, I noticed subtle changes to the language that made certain fee arrangements less transparent. "You made this unnecessarily complicated," Mark said when confronted. "Clients do not read all that fine print anyway." "It does not matter if they read it. We are legally required to disclose it accurately," I insisted. "And we disclosed it. I just made it more digestible," he replied, effectively ending the discussion. By this point, my unease had grown into genuine alarm. I started keeping a separate log of all compliance issues, saving emails to personal backup drives, and documenting conversations with timestamps and direct quotes. Emails 8 through 12 detailed various other circumventions of proper procedure. Melanie noticed the change in my demeanor. We were having lunch in the small park across from our building, a welcome respite from the increasingly tense office atmosphere. "You look like you are carrying the weight of the world, Jess," she said, studying my face with concern. "Is it the new boss?" I hesitated, not wanting to drag her into my professional concerns, but desperately needing someone to talk to. "Mark is dismantling everything we built," I finally admitted, "cutting corners that put us at regulatory risk." "Thomas would have never allowed this," Melanie said, shaking her head. "Thomas is sipping margaritas on Mediterranean beaches," I replied with a sigh. "And I am starting to think Mark was hired specifically because he would be more flexible with compliance." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Document everything, try every diplomatic approach possible, and prepare for the worst," I said, surprised by the resolve in my own voice. I tried multiple approaches to make Mark understand the risks he was creating. I prepared a presentation on recent enforcement actions against similar-sized firms. I shared articles about compliance officers facing personal liability for failures on their watch. I even attempted to appeal to his self-interest, pointing out that his own professional reputation would suffer in the event of regulatory action. Nothing worked. In fact, my efforts seemed to amuse him. "This is how we do things in the real world, Jessica," he would say, as if I were a naive student, rather than a certified professional with years of experience. The big firms I worked for understood the difference between actual risks and theoretical ones. Then came the discovery that changed everything. While reviewing client account activities as part of my monthly reconciliation process, I noticed a pattern of discrepancies in how certain trades were being allocated. Profitable trades seemed to be disproportionately assigned to a small group of accounts, while less successful ones went to others. This was not just a procedural issue, it was a direct violation of SEC regulations prohibiting cherry-picking of trades. It effectively meant some clients were being favored at the expense of others, a serious breach of fiduciary duty. I spent an entire weekend analyzing the data, running statistical analyses to confirm the pattern was not coincidental. By Sunday night, I had conclusive evidence of a violation that could trigger significant penalties and even criminal charges if discovered by regulators. With a knot in my stomach, I prepared documentation email number 13, the most serious one yet. Monday morning, I requested a private meeting with Mark. His assistant initially tried to put me off, saying his schedule was full, but I insisted it was urgent. Finally, she squeezed me in for 15 minutes before lunch. I arrived at his office with a folder containing my findings graphs, showing the statistical improbability of the trading patterns occurring by chance and relevant regulatory citations. "This will take more than 15 minutes, I said as I closed his door. Mark glanced at his watch with visible annoyance. "I have a lunch appointment with the partners, so make it quick." I laid out the evidence, methodically explaining how certain client accounts were systematically receiving preferential treatment in trade allocations, a clear violation of SEC, Rule 2064-1. These patterns suggest a deliberate allocation system that favors certain accounts, I concluded. This is exactly the kind of cherry-picking that triggered the SEC's $3 million fine against Carlton Financial last year. Mark leaned back in his chair, surprisingly calm, given the seriousness of what I had just presented. After a moment of silence, he actually laughed. Jessica, 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 he said, shaking his head, as if I were an amusing child. You are seeing conspiracies where there are only coincidences. This is why compliance people do not advance to real leadership positions. You get lost in theoretical problems instead of focusing on business growth. I felt my face flush with indignation. This is not theoretical. The statistical probability of these allocation patterns occurring randomly is less than 0.001%. And I am not some junior analyst making wild accusations. I have been doing this for 8 years. That is when he delivered the line that would ultimately be his undoing. Your title was inflated anyway, he said dismissively. Thomas had a soft spot for promoting internal talent beyond their capabilities. The reality is, you are a mid-level analyst, at best working at a regional firm that the SEC barely notices. I sat there momentarily stunned by the naked condescension. This is not about my title or my ego, I finally replied, keeping my voice steady despite my anger. This is about protecting our clients and the firm from serious regulatory violations. These patterns need to stop immediately, and affected clients may need to be made whole. Mark's smile disappeared. What needs to happen is you need to stop looking for problems where none exist. If there are any documentation issues with the allocations, fix them. Make the paperwork clean. That is your job. The implication was clear and disturbing. He was not asking me to fix the actual problem. He was asking me to cover it up. Falsifying documentation would be a separate violation, potentially even more serious, I said carefully. Nobody said anything about falsifying. He snapped, his calm facade cracking slightly. I said fix the documentation. Use your compliance expertise to make sure everything is properly recorded going forward. And the clients who have already been disadvantaged, I pressed. That is all in your imagination, he said, standing to signal the end of our meeting. I have indulged this paranoia long enough. Do your job, or I will find someone who will. The threat hung in the air as I gathered my ignored evidence and left his office. My hands were shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I had just presented evidence of serious violations, and not only was I dismissed, I was essentially being asked to become complicit in covering them up. Back at my desk, I faced an ethical dilemma that would define my career: comply with Mark's implied directive to fix the paperwork or report what I had discovered. Either choice carried significant personal risk. That evening, I met David for coffee after work. As a senior financial analyst, he would understand the implications of what I had found without me having to explain the basics. This is bad, Jessica, he said after I showed him my findings, careful to redact any specific client information. Really bad. These patterns are exactly what regulators look for. Mark wants me to just fix the documentation going forward, I said quietly. David's eyes widened. That is obstruction. It could put you personally at risk. I know, I replied. But if I report it, my career in this industry might be over. No one wants to hire a whistleblower, no matter how justified. And if you do not report it, and it comes out later that you knew, David asked gently, could you live with that? His question hung between us, though we both knew the answer. I had built my career on integrity. Compromising that for job security was not really an option I could live with. I decided on a strategic approach, continued documenting everything meticulously while seeking internal resolution channels before going to regulators. If I could convince leadership to self-report and correct the issues, it would be better for everyone, including the firm. Over the next 3 weeks, I created the most comprehensive documentation system of my career. Every trade allocation that showed the pattern, every relevant email, every conversation with Mark, all meticulously logged with timestamps supporting evidence and regulatory citations. Emails 14 through 26 detailed specific instances of problematic allocations and Mark's refusals to address them. Meanwhile, Mark began excluding me from meetings where compliance matters would be discussed. Investment strategy sessions, new product development, client acquisition planning, all suddenly happened without the compliance department's input. We will loop you in when we need sign-off, was Mark's explanation when I questioned him about it. More disturbing was his attempt to gaslight me about regulatory requirements. During one particularly frustrating exchange about disclosure requirements, he actually said, I think you are misremembering the regulation. It does not require that level of detail. I responded by sending him the exact text of the regulation highlighted and annotated. His reply was a terse noted. The psychological toll began to mount. I started having trouble sleeping, waking at 3 a.m., with anxiety about what violations might be occurring without my knowledge. I questioned my own judgment, wondering if I was overreacting despite the clear evidence. The confident professional I had always been was slowly being eroded by Mark's constant dismissal and belittling. After nearly a month of unsuccessful attempts to get Mark to address the compliance issues, I decided to go over his head. Patricia Winters was the chief operations officer and had been with the firm since its founding. While she was not directly responsible for compliance, her position gave her oversight of all operational aspects of the business, and she reported directly to the partners. I scheduled a meeting with Patricia, preparing yet another comprehensive presentation of the issues. I was careful to present facts without casting aspersions on Mark personally, focusing instead on the regulatory risks to the firm. Patricia listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that gave me hope she understood the seriousness of the situation. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Jessica," she said when I finished. "Compliance is the foundation of everything we do here." "So you will help address these issues?" I asked, feeling the first hint of relief in weeks. "I will certainly discuss these concerns with Mark," she replied, her tone measured. "He has extensive experience with regulatory matters from his time at larger institutions. I am sure there is a reasonable explanation for these patterns you have identified." My heart sank. The reasonable explanation line was exactly what Mark had been using to dismiss my concerns. "The statistical evidence suggests otherwise," I said, trying to keep frustration from my voice. "Statistics can be interpreted in different ways," Patricia said with a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring but felt condescending. "Let me handle this through the proper channels." True to her word, Patricia did speak with Mark. I know because the retaliation began the very next day. In our weekly department meeting, Mark called on me to explain a minor discrepancy in a routine report, a task that would normally be handled privately or by a junior analyst. "Jessica, perhaps you can explain to the team why this basic reconciliation is incorrect," he asked, projecting the document on the screen for everyone to see. The discrepancy was actually due to a last-minute transaction that had been processed after the reporting cutoff, something Mark knew perfectly well. But he forced me to explain this obvious point to the entire department, as if I had made a rookie mistake. It was just the beginning. Suddenly I found myself assigned impossible deadlines, often being given complex compliance reviews at 4 p.m. that were somehow needed by 9 a.m. the next morning. My work, previously praised for its thoroughness, was now criticized for being overly detailed and missing the forest for the trees. During one particularly difficult week, Mark sent back a compliance report I had prepared with so many arbitrary revisions that I had to work until midnight 3 days in a row to incorporate his changes, only to have him criticize the final product for inconsistency. "Your performance is becoming a concern," he told me during my monthly one-on-one meeting. "I am not seeing the kind of adaptability and business focus that we need in this role." "My focus is on keeping the firm compliant with regulations," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. That is literally the job description. Part of compliance is understanding business realities and finding compliant ways to achieve business goals, he countered, not just saying no to everything. "I have never simply said no," I defended myself. "I have always offered compliant alternatives when identifying issues." "That is not how the investment team sees it," he said with a shrug. "They find you rigid and uncooperative." It was a blatant lie. I had always had excellent relationships with the investment team, who appreciated that my clear guidelines kept them from inadvertently crossing regulatory lines. But now Mark was poisoning my professional reputation within the firm. As this was happening, I discovered even more serious violations. While reviewing new account documentation, I found evidence that client risk tolerance questionnaires had been altered after submission to justify putting conservative clients into higher risk, higher fee investment products. This was not just a regulatory issue, but potentially fraud. Clients who had explicitly stated they could not tolerate significant losses were being placed in investment vehicles that explicitly warned of the potential for substantial downside risk. I documented these findings in emails 27 through 30, each meticulously detailed with evidence, regulatory citations, and potential penalties. Each was met with the same dismissive response from Mark: "Concerns noted. Handled." But nothing was being handled. The violations continued, and in some cases worsened. The emotional toll was becoming unbearable. I developed insomnia, often lying awake, replaying confrontations with Mark, or worrying about the clients who were being put at risk. I lost weight as my appetite diminished under the constant stress. Even my parents noticed the change during our weekly phone calls, commenting that I did not sound like myself. Through it all, Melanie remained a steadfast support, witnessing the mistreatment and offering what comfort she could. "He is trying to break you," she said during one of our lunch breaks after witnessing a particularly humiliating exchange where Mark had dismissed my input in front of a client. "He knows you are right, and it threatens him." "Why does no one else see what is happening?" I asked, fighting back tears of frustration. "People see," she assured me, "but they are afraid. Mark has the partner's confidence, and everyone has bills to pay." In late June, Mark took his most aggressive step, yet informing me that he was redistributing compliance responsibilities for efficiency. What this meant in practice was that many of my core duties were being reassigned to Kyle, a junior analyst who had joined the firm just 6 months earlier. Kyle was bright but inexperienced with no background in regulatory compliance before joining Horizon. He looked thoroughly uncomfortable when Mark announced he would now be handling key compliance reviews previously under my purview. "I am still happy to help with these," I told Kyle privately after the meeting, not wanting him to think I resented him personally. "I do not know why he is doing this," Kyle admitted, looking stressed. "I keep telling him I do not have the background for some of these reviews." Then came the most alarming discovery yet. While working late one evening on a quarterly audit, I gained access to records showing that client funds were being improperly allocated in ways that benefited the firm's own trading accounts. It appeared that profitable trades were being retroactively assigned to the firm's proprietary account, while losing trades went to client accounts. This was beyond negligence or cutting corners. This was potentially criminal conduct. I added this to my documentation, bringing my total to 35 meticulously detailed emails that now chronicled a pattern of escalating violations. Each one addressed to Mark, each one effectively ignored. The final straw came on a Tuesday in July. While preparing for an annual client review, I discovered evidence that client statements had been deliberately falsified to conceal trading losses. Comparing the actual trading records with the statements sent to clients, I found discrepancies that could not be explained by honest mistakes. Specific investment losses had been categorized as timing adjustments or rebalancing costs, rather than the significant losses they actually were. For several major clients, this misrepresentation painted a completely false picture of their portfolio performance. This was textbook fraud, pure and simple, the kind that ruins firms and sends people to prison. I scheduled an immediate meeting with Mark, not even bothering to prepare a formal presentation. The evidence was so clear, so undeniable, that I believed even he would have to acknowledge the severity of the situation. I was wrong. "These are just alternative presentation formats," Mark said after barely glancing at the documentation I had placed on his desk. "All the information is there if you know how to read it." "No reasonable person would interpret timing adjustment to mean a 15% loss on their investment," I replied, struggling to keep my composure. "This is deliberate misrepresentation." "You are overstepping your role again, Jessica," Mark said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Your job is to ensure we have documentation, not to critique investment strategy communication." "My job is to ensure regulatory compliance, and this," I said, pointing to the falsified statements, "is securities fraud." Mark stood up, suddenly looming over his desk. "Know your place, or find another one," he snapped, his composed facade finally cracking. "I am tired of your constant interference and second-guessing. The partners have complete confidence in my methods. Who do you think they will believe? A senior executive with 15 years at top firms, or a local compliance officer who cannot see the big picture?" I gathered the documents with shaking hands and left without another word. His threat was clear, and for the first time I was genuinely afraid for my job. But I was more afraid of what would happen if I remained silent. The weekend that followed was the most difficult of my professional life. I barely slept, weighing my options and the potential consequences of each. On Saturday, I called my former mentor from my previous firm, being careful not to disclose specific details that would violate confidentiality. "Based on what you are describing, you have 3 choices," she told me, after listening to my carefully anonymized situation. "Look the other way and become complicit, quit, and hope someone else catches it or report it and accept the potential career fallout." "What would you do?" I asked. There was a long pause before she answered. I would like to think I would have the courage to do the right thing even at personal cost, but it is easier to say that when it is not your mortgage on the line. On Sunday, I researched whistleblower protections and federal reporting requirements. The Dodd-Frank Act provided certain protections, but I harbored no illusions about the potential impact on my career. The financial industry, despite its size, was a small world when it came to reputations. While doing this research, I made another disturbing discovery. Accessing some of my previous compliance reports remotely, I found that several had been altered after submission. Key warnings and red flags I had documented had been removed or downplayed, making it appear that I had signed off on activities I had actually flagged as problematic. Mark was not just ignoring my warnings, he was actively falsifying records to make it look like the compliance department had approved his actions. If regulators ever investigated, he was setting me up to take the fall. That was the moment my decision became clear. This had moved beyond protecting my job or even my career. This was now about protecting myself from potential legal liability for actions I had explicitly warned against. Monday morning, I arrived at work with a clarity of purpose I had not felt in months. I spent the day finalizing what would become my 40-second documentation email, a comprehensive summary of all the issues I had identified, categorized by severity and regulatory impact, with clear evidence attached for each. The email was addressed to Mark with a note that this would be my final attempt to address these issues internally before exploring other options. I did not explicitly threaten to go to regulators, but the implication was clear. His response came within minutes. "Do what you need to do. We stand by our practices." It was all the confirmation I needed that internal channels had been exhausted. That night I barely slept, but for the first time in months, it was not anxiety keeping me awake. It was the certainty that I was finally taking control of an impossible situation. Tuesday morning, I arrived at the office an hour early before most of the staff would be in. I needed to gather final documentation that was only accessible from my work computer. Methodically, I downloaded copies of key reports, email exchanges, and account records that supported my allegations, being careful to include nothing that contained client personally identifiable information. At exactly 9 a.m., I submitted my evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission through their whistleblower portal. I followed this with submissions to the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority and the Department of Justice's Financial Crimes Division. Each submission included my 42 documented warnings, categorized by violation type. Category 1. Improper trade allocations, benefiting certain accounts at the expense of others. Category 2. Falsification of client risk tolerance documentation. Category 3. Misleading fee, disclosures. Category 4. Falsified client statements, concealing losses. Category 5. Evidence of document alteration to conceal compliance warnings. For each category, I included specific examples, regulatory citations, and a timeline of when I had brought these issues to management's attention and the response received. After clicking the final submission button, I sat back in my chair and took a deep breath. A strange mixture of emotions washed over me, relief that I had finally taken action, fear about what would happen next, uncertainty about my future, but also a profound sense of vindication. I had done everything possible to address these issues internally. The record was clear on that. The rest of the day passed in a surreal haze. I went about my normal duties, attended scheduled meetings, and responded to emails as if it were any other Tuesday. Only I knew that within hours, federal regulators would likely be contacting Horizon's leadership. Around 2 p.m., I noticed unusual activity. Mark was called into an urgent meeting with the partners. Minutes later, Patricia and the head of legal joined them. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see animated discussion with Mark gesturing emphatically, while the others looked increasingly concerned. At 3:30 p.m., a company-wide email announced a mandatory staff meeting for the following morning to discuss an upcoming regulatory review. The email stressed that this was routine and no cause for concern, which immediately signaled to everyone that it was neither routine nor unconcerning. Mark emerged from the conference room looking visibly shaken. He went straight to his office without acknowledging anyone, closing his door firmly behind him. For the rest of the afternoon, a parade of senior managers visited his office for brief, intense conversations. By 5 p.m., rumors were flying throughout the office. Most people assumed it was just a routine audit, but those who had been with the firm longer recognized the unusual pattern of closed-door meetings and hushed conversations. "What is going on?" Melanie whispered when she stopped by my desk. "Legal has been making copies of trade allocation records all afternoon." "I have no idea," I lied, hating the deception, but knowing it was necessary for now. The next morning I arrived to find two unfamiliar men in suits being escorted to the main conference room by the head of legal. Their visitor badges identified them as being from the SEC's Enforcement Division. The company-wide meeting was brief and tense. Patricia announced that regulatory authorities had requested documentation related to our trading practices and client disclosures. "This is likely a routine examination, but we are cooperating fully," she assured the nervous staff. "Please provide any requested documentation promptly and direct any questions from the examiners to the legal department." Mark was noticeably absent from the meeting. When someone asked about this, Patricia simply said he was working directly with the review team. As the meeting dispersed, Patricia approached me directly. "Jessica, the SEC representatives have specifically requested to speak with you as part of their review. They will be in the main conference room at 11 a.m. Her tone was professional, but I could see the questions in her eyes. She was wondering why they had asked for me by name. "Of course," I replied calmly. "I am happy to assist." For the next 2 hours, I prepared myself mentally for the interview, reviewing key documents and timeline events. At precisely 11 a.m., I walked to the conference room, passing Mark's office on the way. Through the partially open door, I could see him on the phone, his face flushed with anger or fear, possibly both. As I entered the conference room, the two SEC investigators stood to greet me. The lead investigator, a serious woman in her 50s, got straight to the point. "Miss Lawrence, we understand you are the senior compliance analyst here at Horizon. We have some questions about compliance protocols and specific transactions." As I sat down across from them, I caught Mark watching through the glass wall, his expression unreadable. In that moment, I felt an odd sense of calm. After months of being dismissed and belittled, someone was finally going to listen. The text message from my former colleague came exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes after I entered the conference room with the SEC investigators. "Holy shit, Mark just got escorted out. What did you do?" I did not respond immediately. I was still processing the 3-hour interview with the investigators, during which I had walked them through each category of violations, provided context for the documentation I had submitted, and answered their increasingly alarmed questions. They had been especially interested in the evidence that compliance warnings had been altered after submission, with one investigator commenting that this showed consciousness of guilt on Mark's part. The aftermath unfolded with stunning speed. By the end of that first day, Mark had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Within a week, the firm announced his termination for violations of company policies and regulatory requirements. The SEC investigation expanded rapidly, with a team of examiners taking over a small conference room that became their temporary headquarters. They interviewed virtually every member of the investment and operations teams, focusing particularly on the trade allocation practices and client statement discrepancies I had identified. For my part, I found myself in a strange limbo. I was neither celebrated nor ostracized, but rather treated with a careful deference by management and curious caution by colleagues. Many suspected I had something to do with the investigation, but were unsure exactly what role I had played. 3 weeks into the investigation, Patricia requested a private meeting with me. I entered her office, uncertain what to expect. "Jessica, I owe you an apology," she began, surprising me with her directness. "When you came to me with concerns about Mark's practices, I failed to take them seriously enough." "You referred me back to Mark," I acknowledged, not hiding the hurt in my voice. "I did, and that was a serious error in judgment," she admitted. "I trusted his experience and reputation over your specific concerns, and that was wrong." Her apology seemed genuine, but it also came after the damage had been done, and external authorities were involved. Still, it was something. "The partners have been briefed on your attempts to address these issues internally," Patricia continued. "All 42 documented warnings. They are impressed by your diligence and disturbed by how your concerns were handled." I said nothing, waiting to see where this was going. "We are implementing a complete restructuring of our compliance department," she explained, "with stronger oversight and direct reporting lines to the board, not just to operations. We would like you to lead this new department as Chief Compliance Officer." The offer stunned me. After months of being undermined and dismissed, they were now offering me a senior leadership position. I would need certain guarantees, I said carefully, having thought about this possibility during the sleepless nights of the past weeks. Complete autonomy in compliance matters, direct access to the board, a dedicated budget for compliance systems and training, and a seat at the leadership table for all strategic decisions. Patricia nodded. The partners anticipated most of these requests. We are prepared to meet them all. 2 days later, I accepted the position, but not without mixed emotions. While vindicated professionally, I still struggled with the personal impact of the previous months. The stress had taken a toll on my health and confidence that would take time to rebuild. The broader consequences for Horizon were significant, but not fatal. The firm agreed to a settlement with the SEC that included a substantial financial penalty disgorgement of improper gains and a 3-year probationary period with enhanced oversight. Most importantly, they self-corrected the client accounts that had been disadvantaged by the improper trade allocations, making them whole with interest. Several clients left unwilling to trust the firm after the revelations, but most stayed after being assured of the new compliance measures being implemented. The partners learned a costly but valuable lesson about the importance of a strong compliance culture. As for Mark, the consequences were more severe. Beyond losing his position at Horizon, he faced civil charges from the SEC and potential criminal charges from the Department of Justice for securities fraud. His professional reputation was destroyed, and his prospects of working in the financial industry again were virtually non-existent. I took no pleasure in his downfall despite the months of mistreatment I had endured. What happened at Horizon was not about personal vindication, but about protecting clients and the integrity of the system. The clients who trusted us with their retirement savings and college funds deserved better than to have their trust exploited for short-term gains. The personal growth that came from this experience was profound if painful. I rediscovered my professional confidence and developed a deeper understanding of my own ethical boundaries. I learned that sometimes standing alone is necessary even when it comes at personal cost. My relationships with colleagues evolved as well. Some, like Melanie and David, became even closer allies, having witnessed the challenges I faced. Others, who had remained silent during Mark's tenure, approached me privately to express their admiration for my courage. A few remained distant, perhaps uncomfortable with the disruption the investigation had caused regardless of its necessity. In my new role as Chief Compliance Officer, I worked to create the kind of compliance culture I had always envisioned, one where raising concerns was viewed as protecting the firm, not obstructing business. Where documentation was valued as risk management, not bureaucratic busywork. Where doing the right thing was recognized as good business, not just good ethics. 6 months after the investigation began, I received a letter from the SEC, acknowledging my role in bringing the violations to light, and noting that my actions had protected investors from significant harm. It was not a public acknowledgement, the investigation itself remained confidential, but it was a professional validation that meant more to me than any promotion or title. Sometimes being right is not enough. You need the courage to act on it, even when everyone else thinks you are wrong. You need to be willing to risk your job, your relationships, and your reputation to uphold what you know is right. It is not easy, and it is not without cost, but at the end of the day, you have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror. Have you ever had to stand up for what is right at work or in your personal life, even when it was difficult? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they are not alone in facing ethical challenges in their professional life. Remember, integrity is not just about following rules. It is about having the courage to defend them when no one else will. Thank you for listening to my story.